Have you ever seen the giant staircases of Tartaria and thought, who was this even built for? Because some old cities have entrances that look like they were made for people of giant height. Look at these steps. The first step is almost up to your knee. The doors are taller than two adults stacked together, and nearby there are windows. But they sit half underground, like the city ate an entire floor. And here's the scary part. This isn't one building. You find entrances like this in different countries, different styles, different years, and they all give you the same feeling. We arrived too late, and we're walking on the top layer. Officially, they'll tell you it's just decoration, or it's for big crowds. But then why do old photos show the street level lower, and later it's suddenly higher, like the whole city was raised? Why do some staircases look like they were rebuilt, but nobody explains why? So, what was it really? An entrance for giants, or a clue that an older city was hidden under a new layer of ground? Have you ever seen the giant staircases of Tartaria and thought, who was this even built for? Because some old cities have entrances that look like they were made for people of giant height. Look at these steps. The first step is almost up to your knee. The doors are taller than two adults stacked together, and nearby there are windows. But they sit half underground, like the city ate an entire floor. And here is the scary part. This is not one building. You find entrances like this in different countries, different styles, different years, and they all give you the same feeling. We arrived too late, and we are walking on the top layer. Officially, they will tell you, it is just decoration, or it is for big crowds. But then why do old photos show the street level lower, and later it is suddenly higher? Like the whole city was raised? Why do some staircases look like they were rebuilt, but nobody explains why? So, what was it really? An entrance for giants? Or a clue that an older city was hidden under a new layer of ground? Before we go further, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this investigation is going to take us through buried floors, missing archives, and a pattern that repeats across continents. You will not want to miss what we find. Now, let us start where every investigation should start, with a measurement. In St. Petersburg, at the base of a government building constructed in the early 19th century, a visitor stands on the first step. The stone edge reaches her mid-shin. She lifts her foot awkwardly, almost stumbling. The second step is the same, and the third. By the time she reaches the entrance, she has climbed what feels like a small wall. The doorway rises above her. The frame could fit two people standing on each other's shoulders. The bronze handles sit at chest height for a tall man. Yet, the building was commissioned for clerks, for administrators, for ordinary people conducting ordinary business. No official record explains the proportions. In Vienna, at a palace entrance built decades later, the same proportions appear. The stairs demand effort. The doors demand looking up. A photograph from 1891 shows visitors gathered at the base, and something seems wrong. The street sits lower than the first step by nearly 1 meter. A later photograph, taken in 1923, shows the same entrance, but the street has risen. The first step now barely clears the pavement. The building did not sink. The city grew upward around it. In Boston, at a granite structure completed before the Civil War, the pattern repeats. Steps that strain the legs, doorways that dwarf the human frame, and in the basement level, windows that clearly once looked out at open air now peer up from below the sidewalk, half buried. The discrepancy deepens. These are not isolated oddities. They are not just decorative flourishes. They appear in Moscow, in Philadelphia, in Buenos Aires, in Edinburgh. Different architects, different empires, different centuries. Yet the proportions line up with unsettling consistency. A step height of 45 to 60 centimeters. Doorways exceeding 4 meters. Handrails placed so high they feel made for longer arms than ours. One building could be an artistic choice. Two could be coincidence. But when the same measurements appear in cities separated by oceans and decades, something else starts to form. A pattern, a language, a standard that nobody talks about anymore. And then there are the photographs. In nearly every city where these stairs exist, old images survive. And in those images, something is wrong with the ground. Streets sit lower, entrances stand taller, windows that now hide underground once opened to sunlight and air. The buildings did not move, the cities did. One photograph, discovered in a municipal archive during a renovation in Prague, shows a cathedral entrance in 1867. The base of the staircase rests on cobblestones. A carriage passes at street level, and the driver's head barely reaches the third step. A later photograph, dated 1902, shows the same entrance. But now, the street has climbed. The carriage would reach the fifth step, and the basement windows have vanished entirely beneath new pavement. The archive contains no explanation for the change. The record ends abruptly. What happened between those photographs? Why did the ground rise? And why does nobody talk about it? The answer is not simple. But it begins with a question that most people never think to ask. What if we are walking on top of an older city without knowing? If these stairs were built for giants, there should be a pattern, a clean, repeatable logic, measurements that match a body larger than ours. So, let us test it. The human body follows predictable proportions. A comfortable step height for an average adult falls between 15 and 18 centimeters. Handrails sit at roughly 90 centimeters. Doorways rise to 2 meters, sometimes slightly more. These numbers are not random. They come from how our legs bend, how our arms reach, how our eyes meet the world. Now consider what we find at these old entrances. Step heights of 45 to 60 centimeters, handrails at 130 centimeters or higher, doorways exceeding 4 meters. If these proportions served a body, that body would stand between 3 and 4 meters tall. The stride would cover nearly 2 meters. The shoulders would span wider than most modern doorways. No skeleton matching these dimensions has ever been verified, yet the proportions persist. In 1897, a German engineer named Wilhelm Krauss wrote a study on municipal stair design. His research covered 43 public buildings across Central Europe. In his notes, discovered decades later in a Hamburg University archive, Krauss recorded a strange observation. The oldest structures in his survey consistently featured step heights 30 to 40%, larger than modern comfort standards. He noted that these stairs caused visible strain in visitors. Elderly citizens avoided them entirely. Children needed help. Krauss proposed that the original designers had made mistakes in calculation. But his own measurements pushed back against that idea. The step heights were not chaotic. They repeated with precision across buildings separated by hundreds of kilometers. The same 48 centimeters appeared in Dresden, in Prague, in Krakow, in structures built by different architects, under different governments, across different decades. Mistakes do not copy themselves that cleanly. Krauss's study was never published in full. His notes survived only because a nephew donated them to the university after Krauss's death in 1914. In the margin of the final page, there is a single sentence in faded pencil. The consistency suggests a standard I cannot locate. The record ends there. But Krauss was measuring something real. And when we apply his method today, the pattern still holds. Consider a building in Lyon, France, a municipal hall constructed in 1856. The entrance staircase rises 12 steps to a doorway framed in limestone. Each step measures 46 centimeters in height. The doorway stands 4.3 meters tall. The bronze handles sit at 140 centimeters. If you designed an entrance for a human 3.2 meters tall, these are exactly the kinds of proportions you would choose. Across the Atlantic, in Philadelphia, a customs house completed in 1848 shows nearly identical numbers. Step height, 44 centimeters. Doorway, height, 4.1 meters. Handle position, 138 centimeters. The architects never worked together. The buildings serve different purposes. The governments that commissioned them shared no common construction rulebook, yet the numbers align. This is where the giant theory feels like it finally has something solid, not fantasy, not myth. Measurement. Cold, repeated dimensions that serve no human body comfortably. But the theory also finds its first crack here. Because when we look closer at these buildings, something else appears, something the giant explanation cannot cover. In Lyon, beneath the grand staircase, a basement level exists. The windows of this level once opened at street height. Photographs from 1861 confirm it. Visitors entered through the basement door for deliveries and service. The main staircase served ceremonial purposes only. But in photographs from 1894, the basement windows sit below ground. Soil covers half their height. The service door has been sealed. A new sidewalk runs where the old street once lay. The staircase did not change, the city rose around it, and in Philadelphia, the same thing happens. Lithographs from the 1850s show the customs house standing on level ground. The basement receives full sunlight. By 1901, photographs show the basement half buried. New pavement covers the original street. The building did not sink into the earth. The earth came to the building. This changes everything, because if the ground level shifted after construction, then the staircases we see today may not reflect the original entrance the architects planned. The proportions we measure can be warped by a city that moved upward. A first step that now reaches your knee might once have begun at a normal street height. The giant entrance problem is not about giants at all. It is about what lies beneath. If the ground rose, then something was buried. And if something was buried, it might still be there. This is where the investigation shifts, from staircases to foundations, from what we can see above to what we are not meant to notice below. In cities across Europe and North America, the same strange feature keeps showing up. Buildings with basement windows that clearly once faced open air now peer up from beneath sidewalks, like eyes half closed in sleep. Doors that once worked as real entrances now open into storage rooms below street level. Entire floors have slipped into the earth. Not smashed, not torn down, not erased with a wrecking ball, just covered. In Edinburgh, along the Royal Mile, tourists walk above a hidden city. In the late 18th century, the city council approved a series of bridges and stone platforms to connect the hills of the old town. Instead of demolishing everything in the low valleys, they built over it. Streets became tunnels, ground floors became basements. A whole layer of Edinburgh fell out of sight, while life continued on top. Those buried streets were rediscovered in the 20th century. Tours now take visitors through underground chambers. Guides talk about plague victims and poverty. But the stonework below tells a wider story. The doorways underground are tall. The ceilings rise higher than most modern builders would bother to pay for. The stairs descend at angles that make your legs work harder than you expect. And that is the unsettling part. The proportions below match what we find above ground in Lyon, in Philadelphia, in St. Petersburg. The pattern survives even underground. In Seattle, something similar happened, only this time, we can name the moment. After the Great Fire of 1889, city planners faced a brutal problem. The original streets sat too low. High tides flooded the commercial district again and again. Sewage lines failed. Mud and water turned streets into traps. So they did something extreme. They raised the streets by 1 to 2 full stories. Old ground floors became basements overnight. Merchants moved their businesses upstairs into what used to be second floors. Skylights were cut into the new sidewalks to push daylight down into the buried spaces below. For decades, parts of that underground city were still reachable. Then doors were closed, passages were sealed. The whole thing faded from daily life until it was rediscovered in the 1960s by curious historians. The records from the street raising project still exist in the Seattle Municipal Archives. They list the engineering plans, the costs, the labor crews, the deadlines, but they also contain a gap that feels like a missing tooth. Several buildings in the raised district already had basement levels before the fire. After the city lifted the street, those basements should have become sub-basements, buried even deeper. Yet there are no clear excavation logs for those lower levels, no inspection notes, no permits describing how they were filled, sealed, or stabilized. At a certain point, the paperwork simply stops talking about them. What lies beneath some of Seattle's buried floors remains undocumented. In Moscow, construction crews stumbled into a similar silence in 2007. During excavation for a new metro line beneath Tverskaya Street, workers broke through into a vaulted chamber. Inside were signs of an older world, a stone floor, fragments of decorative tile, and a doorway leading deeper into darkness. The doorway stood 3.8 meters tall. Engineers documented the discovery. Photos circulated briefly among supervisors on the project. And then, the chamber was filled with concrete to stabilize the tunnel route. The photographs did not appear in the final report. A supervisor who saw it later told a journalist the chamber looked like part of something larger. He said the walls stretch beyond the dig zone in more than one direction. He believed the stonework was older than anything the official records admit for that neighborhood. And he could not stop talking about the door. He described it as the kind of doorway you would build if you expected someone much bigger than a normal person to walk through. The interview ran in a small local paper. No major outlet followed it. The supervisor refused to say more after that. Today, concrete covers whatever else that chamber held. This is the pattern that starts to haunt the buried floor theory. Discovery followed by silence. Notes followed by gaps. Evidence that surfaces for a moment, then disappears into official calm. Not always a loud conspiracy. Something quieter. Something that looks like bureaucracy, but feels like forgetting. And yet, the physical clues remain. In Edinburgh, underground doorways still stand at their original height. In Seattle, buried storefronts still carry tall windows behind sealed openings. In Moscow, somewhere beyond a metro wall, a tall doorway waits in darkness. The city's rose. The older layers vanished from view. But they did not stop existing. They simply became invisible, which raises a question no archive seems eager to answer. If buried floors exist in so many cities, following such similar patterns, how many other layers lie beneath the streets we walk today? And what was on those streets before the ground swallowed them? If buried layers exist beneath one city, they might exist beneath many, and if the giant staircases follow a pattern, that pattern should show up on a map. So, we built one, using photographs, architectural surveys, and municipal records. We marked every confirmed case of oversized entrance stairs across Europe and North America, buildings where step heights exceeded 40 centimeters, doorways above 4 meters, handrails set beyond comfortable human reach. The results were not random. The giant staircases cluster around specific places: ports, cathedrals, government halls, railway terminals, central banks. The buildings that mattered most to 19th century cities, the ones built to project order, wealth, and power. In London, the pattern tightens around the financial district and the old docks. In Paris, it follows the Seine and spreads outward from Notre Dame. In New York, it traces the early shoreline of Manhattan and thickens near old customs facilities. In Vienna, it circles the Hofburg Palace and runs along the ceremonial boulevards. These are not quiet residential streets. These are the hearts of empire. But the map revealed something else, something we did not expect. The giant staircases do not only gather around important buildings, they also line up with specific routes, old processional roads, pilgrimage paths, and trade arteries that existed long before the modern street grids. In Rome, oversized entrances track the ancient Via Flaminia with eerie accuracy. In Mexico City, they follow the old causeways that once crossed Lake Texcoco. In Istanbul, they line the route from the Golden Horn toward Hagia Sophia. The stairs were not placed like decoration. They were placed along paths designed for movement, for crowds, for cargo, for something heavy. A document in the Vienna State Archive offers a clue. In 1847, a city planner named Johann Esterle submitted a proposal to widen several central streets. His report included a survey of existing structures along the proposed route. In his notes, Esterle recorded that 17 buildings featured entrance stairs of unusual proportion. He described them with 2 words: processional grade. The term appears nowhere else in the archive. No architectural dictionary from that period defines it. Yet Esterle used it as if everyone reading would understand, as if processional grade was common knowledge. His proposal was approved. The streets were widened. Several buildings he surveyed were demolished. The surviving structures had their stairs adjusted to match the new pavement level. Esterle's original measurements were not kept. Only his summary report remains. Yet the phrase stays behind like a fingerprint. Processional grade. Stairs built not for daily use, but for moments when the city moved as one body. Festivals, coronations, funerals of kings, arrivals of armies, days when thousands of feet hit the stone in the same rhythm. This explanation solves part of the mystery. Big stairs handle big crowds. Wide treads reduce the chance of crushing. Tall doorways let banners, canopies, and carried objects pass through without dipping or folding. But it does not solve everything, because processional routes existed in every major city. Yet giant staircases appear in some places and not others. They bunch in certain districts, then ignore the neighborhoods just one street away. They cling to old paths that sometimes cut against later city planning entirely. And then there is Chicago. In Chicago, oversized entrances cluster along streets that do not exist anymore. The Great Fire of 1871 erased the original grid. The city was rebuilt fast with a changed plan. Yet buildings constructed after the fire, in the same general zones, still repeated the giant proportions. The architects of 1872 were not copying buildings that burned. Those structures were gone, turned to ash. Yet the same kinds of measurements returned anyway, as if the proportions were not tied to the style, as if they were tied to the land. A surveyor's note from the Chicago Reconstruction Project hints at why. In 1873, a team measuring foundation depths along LaSalle Street recorded an anomaly. Beneath the fire rubble, they found older foundations, stone footings that did not match any structure listed in the pre-fire records. The footings were massive. The doorway openings they framed exceeded 4 meters. The surveyor wrote that new buildings should line up with those older foundations for stability. His recommendation was followed, and the giant proportions returned, not because someone wanted giant stairs, because something under the surface pushed the city back into the same shape. So, the map does not simply show where giant stairs were built. It shows where giant stairs kept being built, generation after generation, fire after fire, rebuild after rebuild, as if the pattern was older than any archive could remember. The pattern felt older than the archives could remember. But archives do remember some things. And when we studied the construction records closely, the timeline began to crack. We expected to find original blueprints, clean documentation, a simple chain, architect to builder to finished structure. We found something else. In city after city, the oldest giant staircases shared a strange trait. Their paper trails were incomplete, not totally gone, that would be obvious. Instead, they were broken into pieces, partial files, missing pages, gaps that nobody seemed in a hurry to explain. In Philadelphia, the Customs House records list materials purchased and laborers hired. They document the laying of the cornerstone in 1848. They describe the dedication ceremony in 1855. But the actual construction drawings have never been located. The archive contains a note from 1911 stating the original plans were transferred to a federal repository. The federal repository has no record of receiving them. The building exists. Its blueprints do not. In Lyon, the municipal hall tells a similar story. Invoices survive for stone, timber, and bronze. Contracts name the primary contractors. But the architectural specifications vanish after 1859. A fire in 1871 destroyed part of the city archive. Yet here is what makes your stomach tighten. Other buildings from the same decade still have complete documentation. The missing sections keep appearing around the same kind of structure, the ones with oversized entrances. Once is bad luck. Twice is annoying. After a while, coincidence starts to feel thin. And then we found the reconstruction notes. In nearly every city we surveyed, the giant staircases show signs of modification. Steps recut, landings extended, handrails shifted. You can see it across time like a flipbook. A staircase in 1867 does not quite match the same staircase in 1894. Proportions change, stone types change, the whole feel changes. Yet permits rarely explain it. In Prague, a cathedral entrance underwent a visible modification between 1873 and 1901. Photographs confirm it. The older stair had 12 steps. The later photos show 14. The step height drops. The total rise stays the same. Someone added steps to make the climb easier, but the cathedral archive contains no record of this work. The municipal building office has no permit on file. The change appears in no budget line, no contract, no official correspondence. The stairs changed. The paperwork did not. And that silence repeats across the map. Boston, Buenos Aires, Edinburgh. Staircases that clearly shifted over time without leaving a clean trail, as if someone wanted the changes to blend into the background, or as if the changes happened so far back that nobody alive knew where the paperwork went. But the deepest crack in the timeline came from A source we did not expect, not a photograph, not a missing blueprint, a single phrase in a city planning document from St. Petersburg. In 1884, the city council approved a project to raise the embankment along the Neva River. The project files are detailed. They list engineering problems, labor needs, and the effect on nearby buildings. And in one passage, while discussing adjustments to a government building entrance, the document uses words that stop you mid-sentence. Restore to original grade. Not raise, not redesign, not improve. Restore. That single word changes the meaning of everything. It implies the entrance had already been altered once before. And the 1884 project was not inventing a new layout. It was returning the stairs to an earlier setup. A setup that predates the surviving records. The document does not say when the first alteration happened. It does not name who ordered it. It does not explain why it was done. It just assumes the reader already knows. Restore to original grade. But what was the original grade? How far back does original go? And why did it need restoring in the first place? No answers. The project was completed in 1886. The entrance today matches the 1884 specifications. Whatever existed before that remains unlisted, unmeasured, unspoken. This is the moment the investigation shifts. We are no longer looking at giant staircases as odd design choices. We are looking at a repeated urban language, a way of building that appears across continents, a language that somebody kept adjusting, a language whose first version has been blurred so badly that even official documents refer to it like a passing detail. The timeline did not crack because every record was burned. It cracked because the records that survived tell a story nobody expected us to read closely. Something existed before the buildings we see today. Something with its own proportions, its own standards, its own grade. And that something was not just forgotten. It was systematically buried. The burial was real. The modifications were real. But before we follow that thread deeper, we have to test the simplest explanations first. If the stairs were not built for giants, who were they built for? The most common answer is crowds. Think about what a public entrance had to handle in the 19th century. Festivals that pulled in thousands, state funerals where whole cities came out to mourn, religious processions that moved through streets like slow rivers of people, elections, coronations, declarations of war and peace. These were not moments for single-file entry. They demanded mass movement, hundreds of people going up and down at the same time, bodies close together, a flow that could not stop without someone getting hurt. Today, crowd safety experts understand this problem in simple terms. A narrow staircase with small steps creates a bottleneck. People bunch up at the bottom. Pressure builds. One stumble turns into 10. Panic follows. Wide stairs with deep treads reduce that risk. They allow multiple streams of traffic. They give feet a stable place to land, even when you cannot see the step clearly because someone is right in front of you. They lower the chance of crushing, the kind of deadly compression we still see at stadium exits and packed concert venues. And when you look at the so-called giant staircases through that lens, the design suddenly makes sense. In Paris, the entrance to the Pantheon has stairs that can hold about 12 people across, shoulder to shoulder. The step depth pushes past 40 centimeters, enough room for a full foot to land, enough room to recover from a stumble instead of tumbling forward, enough width for thousands to move in a steady flow. Photographs from the funeral of Victor Hugo in 1885 show the idea in action. Crowds cover every step. A dark river of mourners in coats and dresses moves upward, slow but steady. The stairs absorb the pressure. No crushing, no jam, no visible panic. For a building like that, the crowd theory fits perfectly. In Vienna, ceremonial entrances to the Hofburg served similar needs. Imperial birthdays, military parades, diplomatic receptions. The stairs had to process aristocrats, soldiers, and citizens in volumes most modern buildings never plan for. Here, too, the proportions make sense for crowds. But the theory does not explain everything. In Lyon, the municipal hall entrance shows the same oversized proportions. Yet Lyon did not host imperial processions at that door. The building served local bureaucracy, clerks, registries, permits, taxes, death certificates. The largest documented gathering at that entrance was a protest in 1892 that drew perhaps 300 people. 300 people do not require stairs built for 3,000. In Philadelphia, the customs house served merchants and ship captains. Busy, yes. Constant, yes. But not ceremonial, not a parade route, not the kind of mass movement that demands 46-centimeter steps and giant door frames. So, the crowd theory explains the cathedrals. It explains the palaces. But it struggles with the municipal halls, the customs houses, and the ordinary government buildings that repeat the same proportions without a clear reason. And it does not touch the buried floors. If the stairs were designed for crowds at street level, why did the street level change? If the proportions were meant for human bodies moving in mass, why did those proportions get warped as the ground rose around them? The crowd theory can explain how these stairs were used. It cannot explain why so many of them ended up half buried. Something else was going on, something the processional explanation cannot reach. If crowds explain the cathedrals, maybe cargo explains the rest. 19th century cities moved differently than ours, before trucks and forklifts, before electric cranes. One smooth asphalt. Almost everything heavy traveled by muscle, human muscle and animal muscle. And the entrances of important buildings had to handle that reality. Think about what a customs house actually dealt with. Barrels of molasses weighing hundreds of kilograms, crates of machinery, bolts of fabric stacked on rough wooden pallets, chests of tea, coffee, and spices. All of it arriving by ship. All of it needing to move from dock to warehouse to inspection hall. Men carried what they could. Horses pulled what men could not. Carts rolled where the ground allowed. But there is one problem. Carts do not climb stairs. This is where the design logic shifts. Many so-called giant staircases include features that make little sense for human feet alone. Extra-wide landings spaced at regular intervals, treads deep enough for a hoof to settle safely, and side ramps with gentle slopes running beside the steps. These are not just fancy details. They look like planning for weight. In Boston, the granite customs house entrance includes a side passage that slopes gradually from street level toward the main hall. The passage is too narrow for a full carriage, too wide to be only for a single clerk carrying papers. But it is close to perfect for a horse pulling a loaded sledge, or for porters pushing heavy goods on simple wheels. Here, the cargo theory fits cleanly. In Edinburgh, several commercial buildings near the Old Port show the same split design: stairs for people, ramps for goods. Two routes running in parallel, meeting at platforms where loads could be handed off safely. A merchant's diary from 1856, preserved in the Scottish National Archives, describes the morning routine at one such building. Clerks enter by the main stairs. Porters drag cargo up the side ramp. Horses wait in a cobblestone yard below, breath steaming in the cold air. The building is built for both systems at once, human scale and cargo scale, intertwined. This explanation reaches further than the crowd theory. It can account for municipal halls that receive taxes not only in paper, but in coin and goods. Banks that stored heavy metal and moved it under guard. Post offices that processed freight, not just letters. In that world, weight moved through important buildings every day, and architecture had to make that movement possible. And yet, the theory fractures when we look closer. In Lyon, the municipal hall has no side ramp, no cargo passage, no clear sign that heavy goods use that entrance. The staircase stands alone, massive, exposed, and unsupported by any system for loads. In St. Petersburg, the government building with the giant entrance was tightly administrative. Paper moved through its halls, reports, decrees, decisions. Not barrels, not crates, not anything that needs horses at the door. So, the cargo theory explains the ports, it explains the banks. But it does not explain the purely administrative or ceremonial structures that still repeat, the same oversized proportions. And like the crowd theory, it cannot explain the burial. Cargo ramps become useless when street level rises above them. Doorways designed for loaded sledges become basement openings. The entire system breaks when the ground shifts. If the architects expected the streets to rise, they would not build entrances like this. If they did not expect it, then someone changed the city after the building was already there. Either way, the cargo theory describes a function. It does not explain what happened to that function when cities started burying themselves. Crowds needed space to move. Cargo needed ramps to roll, but there is a third theory that reaches something neither of those can fully explain. Status. In the architecture of power, height is never neutral. Kings sit on thrones raised above their subjects. Judges speak from benches set higher than the room. Altars stand above congregations. The person who looks down holds authority over the person who must look up. So the giant staircases may not have been built for giant bodies. They may have been built for giant egos. This idea has a name. Architects call it the piano nobile, the noble floor. It is a design rule that shaped European buildings for centuries. The concept is simple. The most important rooms do not sit at street level. They sit above it, above the mud, above the smell, above the noise and chaos of daily life. To reach the noble floor, you climb. And that climb is not a side detail. It is part of the message. Every step you take reminds you where you stand in the social order. You are moving towards something higher, something protected, something that demands effort to reach. The stairs are not just stairs, they are theater. In Rome, the Palazzo Farnese shows this clearly. The main entrance leads into a courtyard. From the courtyard, a staircase rises to the first floor. The stairs are wide, the steps are tall, and the doorway at the top frames the visitor against open sky before they enter the reception rooms. The effect is deliberate. You do not simply walk into power, you ascend to it. This language of design spread across Europe during the Renaissance. It reached Russia under Peter the Great. It crossed the Atlantic with colonial administrators. By the 19th century, the piano nobile had become a standard choice for any building that wanted to broadcast authority. Government halls, banks, universities, courts, the places where decisions were made and where the public was meant to feel the weight of those decisions. Through that lens, the giant staircases suddenly fit. They are not sized for giant people. They are sized for giant impressions. Every visitor who climbs them receives the same message. Even if nobody speaks a word, you are small. This institution is not. A British architectural manual from 1838 makes this idea almost blunt. The author, a surveyor named Thomas Penrose, writes that public entrances should inspire appropriate humility in those who approach. He recommends step heights that require visible effort, doorways that force the eye upward, proportions that dwarf the individual and make the structure feel permanent. Penrose was not describing buildings for giants. He was describing buildings designed to make humans feel small. This theory holds for almost every ceremonial structure on our map: palaces, cathedrals, seats of government. Under this logic, the stairs were never meant to feel easy. Comfort was not the goal. Discomfort was the point. But even this theory cannot explain everything, because the piano nobile assumes a stable relationship between building and street. The noble floor sits above the ground. The ground stays where it is. When the ground rises too, that relationship breaks. The noble floor becomes ordinary. The grand entrance turns into a basement door. The theater collapses. Old photographs show this collapse unfolding in slow motion. Buildings that once stood above their streets start to look like they are sinking into them. Not because the walls are falling, because the street is climbing. The piano nobile explains why the stairs were built tall. It does not explain why the cities grew up around them, like soil swallowing a grave. The ground rose. This is no longer a theory. The photographs prove it. The buried windows prove it. The only question left is why. In most cases, the first answer is water. Cities built near rivers flood. Cities built on coastlines fight tides. Cities built on soft clay settle as the weight of stone compresses the soil beneath. And cities built before modern drainage face something we have almost forgotten: mud. Not the annoying mud of a rainy afternoon. Mud as a daily condition. Mud mixed with horse manure, human waste, and rotting garbage. Mud that reached ankle depth after storms. Mud that stank, carried sickness, and turned streets into traps. Mud that could keep a neighborhood half closed for weeks. So, cities chose the simplest solution: raise the streets. Engineers laid new cobblestones on top of old ones. They hauled in dirt, ash, and rubble to build up roadbeds. They built embankments along rivers and filled the space behind them with debris. Layer by layer, the ground climbed. In London, the construction of the Thames Embankment between 1865 and 1870 raised street levels along the river by nearly 2 meters in some places. Buildings that once opened straight onto wharves suddenly faced solid ground. Basement doors became cellar windows. Ground floors became basements. The engineering records still exist. They list the fill material, the labor costs, and the disputes with landowners. The whole thing was public, planned, argued over, and signed off in meetings. That explains a lot of buried floors. In Chicago, the street raising was even more extreme. Beginning in the 1850s, engineers lifted whole blocks using jack screws. Buildings rose on temporary supports while workers poured sand and gravel underneath. Streets that used to flood after every rain became dry and stable. The work took decades. It reshaped the city. And it left behind exactly the kind of odd details we have been tracking. Stairs that once met the street at normal heights now begin above the pavement. Entrances designed for an older grade suddenly require extra steps to reach. So, the flood and mud theory fits the burial pattern almost perfectly. Almost. Because when we studied the records more closely, the numbers started to wobble. In several cities, the documented street raising does not match the depth we can see in the buildings. Officials record raises of 1 meter. The structures show burial closer to 2 meters, or even more. In St. Petersburg, embankment records from the 1880s describe a street lift of 90 centimeters. But photographs from before and after show basement windows that lose nearly 2 full meters of exposure. The numbers do not line up. In Prague, municipal records show no major street raising project during the period when the cathedral entrance clearly changes. Yet, photographs still document a real shift in ground level. Something raised the street. The archives do not say what. So, here is where the story tightens again. The flood theory explains how streets rise. It does not explain why the paperwork often undercounts the change. It does not explain why some buildings end up buried deeper than any documented project should allow. And it does not explain why, in city after city, the mismatch runs in the same direction. The official story is always smaller than the physical evidence suggests. The streets rose to escape mud and water. But at the same time, something else was happening. Something that left fewer clean records and deeper scars. Demolition. The 19th century was an age of rebuilding. Old cities were treated like obstacles to progress. Narrow streets choked traffic. Ancient buildings lacked modern sanitation. Medieval layouts fought the neat, straight lines planners wanted. So, the demolitions began. In Paris, Baron Haussmann cut wide boulevards through neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. Between 1853 and 1870, his crews demolished an estimated 20,000 buildings. Whole districts vanished. Streets that had twisted through the city since the Middle Ages were replaced by straight avenues lined with uniform facades. The official argument was public health. Light and air would reach the streets. Disease would retreat. The city would breathe. But photographs from before the demolitions show something else. Details that now feel uncomfortably familiar. Buildings with oversized entrances. Doorways that rose above 4 meters. Staircases with proportions that match our map almost perfectly. After Haussmann, many of those buildings were gone. In Vienna, a similar shift arrived with a different shape. The old city walls came down in 1857. The space they occupied became the Ringstrasse, a grand circular boulevard lined with new construction. The buildings that had leaned against the walls for centuries were cleared away. Contemporary accounts described what was removed as cramped, dirty, obsolete. But the few photographs that survived tell a more complicated story. Some of those demolished structures carried the same oversized entrance proportions we keep seeing in buildings that escaped the blade. They were not studied. They were not preserved. They were erased. Across Europe and North America, the pattern repeats. Modernization demands destruction, and that destruction tends to hit the oldest layers first. The very buildings most likely to preserve whatever original proportions existed before street raising, before modifications, before the quiet reconstructions that left no paperwork. This is where the investigation turns painful. Because demolition does not only destroy buildings, it destroys memory. It wipes the evidence that would allow future generations to ask the right questions. It flattens messy history into a cleaner story and calls the result improvement. The craftsmen who built the earlier structures left fewer apprentices. Their methods faded. The stonecutters who carved tall doorways handed their skills to workers who would never be asked to build that way again. Proportions that once felt normal in an older urban world became rare, then odd, then mysterious. And eventually, people filled that gap with the simplest, wildest explanation. Not because the knowledge was locked away in a vault, because the knowledge was abandoned. And that leads to the hardest discovery in this whole investigation. The staircase that kicked off our research, the entrance that first made us ask, who was this built for? The steps that hit mid-shin, the doorway that dwarfs every visitor. It was rebuilt. Renovation photographs from 1923 surfaced in a private collection. They show the staircase mid-construction, fresh mortar between stones, workers positioning blocks with period tools, a foreman holding blueprints that do not match any known original documentation. That changes the weight of our evidence, because the strongest giant entrance example was not purely original. It was a reconstruction, built in the 20th century to replace something that had decayed, or something that had been quietly altered decades earlier. The proportions we measured were not guaranteed to be 19th century truth. They were a copy. And we do not know what they were copying. The reconstruction photographs broke something in our research, not the facts, the certainty. We had measured, we had mapped, we had traced patterns across continents and centuries. And now, our strongest example turned out to be a copy of unknown origin, rebuilt decades after the period we thought we were studying. If that staircase was rebuilt, how many others were? So, we went back to the archives with different eyes, not hunting for confirmation anymore, hunting for fractures. We found them everywhere. In Boston, the Customs House stairs were restored in 1915. The project files describe repairs to weathered stone, routine work, maintenance. But photographs from before and after show subtle changes. The handrail sits at a different height. The step depth shifts by nearly 4 centimeters. Small differences, easy to miss if you do not compare images side by side. The specs do not call these changes out. The stone does. In Prague, the cathedral entrance was restored in 1897 and again in 1931. Each restoration introduced adjustments. The 1897 work raised the landing by 15 centimeters. The 1931 work changed the doorframe to meet newer access needs. Neither project preserved the original proportions perfectly. Layer on top of layer. Each generation fixing what the last generation left behind. That is when the ground dropped out from under our neat measurements, because the giant staircases we had measured were not pure artifacts from one lost moment. They were composites. Patchwork entrances built from original fragments, later additions, modern repairs, and quiet tweaks that never made the headline page of any report. The proportions we recorded were not always one design. They were many designs, stacked together, overlapping, drifting, sometimes contradicting each other. And the clean chain of evidence we wanted, blueprint to builder to untouched structure, often did not exist. This was the lowest point of the investigation. We asked if the stairs were built for giants. The answer was no. We asked if the burial pattern proved a hidden world under every modern city. The answer was complicated. We asked if the proportions followed a lost measurement standard. And the answer, frustratingly, was this. The proportions changed so many times that the original standard could not always be recovered with confidence. So, the theories collapsed, one by one. The theory of giant builders collapsed. The theory of a single hidden city beneath every modern city collapsed. The theory of one forgotten measurement system collapsed. So, was it all a mirage? A pattern we invented because we wanted to see one? Not entirely. Because even after we accounted for reconstructions and restorations, something still remained. Not a perfect set of numbers, but a consistent design language. A repeated choice. Ceremonial entrances built bigger than they need to be, made to overwhelm. The human body, made to force the eye upward. That language existed before the reconstructions. It guided the restorations. It shaped what 20th century builders chose to copy. A worker in 1923 did not invent those proportions out of thin air. He followed something, an old blueprint, a tradition, an expectation that public buildings should tower over the people who walk into them. The individual stairs might be composites, but the impulse behind them is older, and that impulse repeats with uncomfortable consistency across cultures that never spoke to each other, across centuries that should not share one rulebook, across buildings that served completely different purposes. The evidence for giants is gone, the evidence for a deliberate design language remains. So, the question shifts. Not who built these stairs, but why did so many different builders in so many different places keep making the same choice? The giant theory collapsed, but something survived that collapse, and what survived deserves a closer look. So we went back to the evidence that stayed solid, not the individual measurements, not one perfect staircase, but the deeper patterns that held up through every modification, every reconstruction, and every street-raising project. 3 patterns remained firm. First, the geometry of crowd movement, wide treads, deep landings, proportions that let hundreds of people climb at the same time without crushing. This logic appears again and again in ceremonial buildings. It is not random, it is not just decoration, it is practical design for mass human movement. Those crowd stairs were real, they served a real function, and that function was completely human. Second, the logic of elevated status, the piano nobile, the raised first floor that lifts power above the street. This principle shaped European construction for centuries. It traveled with empires into colonies, trading posts, and new capitals. Anywhere European-style authority wanted to look permanent, the noble floor showed up. The stairs were tall because the building was meant to impress and intimidate. Not because the builders were giants, because the builders wanted visitors to feel small while approaching something above them. Third, the reality of street raising, floods, mud, sanitation, and new infrastructure push cities upward. Buried floors are not proof of a lost civilization by themselves. They are proof of massive urban engineering, cities solving problems by stacking new layers instead of tearing everything down and starting over. The burial was deliberate, it was planned, and in many places it was bigger than most people realize. These 3 patterns explain almost everything we found. The staircases supported ceremonies, the proportions projected power. The burial came from engineering and survival. No giants required, but even after that, something still bothered the edges of every conclusion. The consistency, crowd design, explains why some stairs are wide. It does not fully explain why the same step height shows up in Lyon, Philadelphia, and Buenos Aires. Status explains why some doorways are tall. It does not fully explain why the same 4-meter scale repeats across places that did not share one local building office. Street raising explains why floors get buried, but it does not fully explain why official records so often undercount the change we can see with our own eyes. The explanations work. The coincidences remain. And this is where an honest investigation has to show humility. We cannot prove a single lost standard once ruled all these cities. Reconstruction destroyed too much. Archives hold too many gaps. The chain of custody breaks too often. But we also cannot wave the consistency away as pure chance. The repetition is too tight. The proportions line up too often. The design language speaks too clearly across distances that should have weakened it. So here is what we can say with confidence. The past was not magic. The builders were not giants. The staircases served human purposes we can reconstruct with reasonable clarity. But the past was also more organized than our broken paperwork suggests, more connected, more systematic. Something helped spread these choices. Something carried a shared sense of what a public entrance should look like. Something made a staircase in Moscow and a staircase in Chicago end up with measurements that feel too similar to be accidental. That something was not supernatural. It was human, it was organized, and it left traces that survive, even demolition. The cover-up was not a secret meeting in a dark room. It was time doing what time always does, erasing details, blurring origins, and leaving us with patterns we can still see. Even when we cannot fully explain where they began, the patterns survived. The explanations hold, but one question still hangs in the air. Why do these stairs feel wrong? Stand at the base of a 19th century government entrance. Look up at the doorway. Put your foot on the first step. Something in your body hesitates. Something quiet inside you whispers that this place was not built for you. That feeling is real, but the explanation is not giants. It is us. Modern architecture is designed for comfort, for speed, for efficiency. We want to move through buildings without thinking. Stairs should disappear under our feet. Doorways should frame us gently. Entrances should feel like an invitation. We have grown used to buildings that try not to speak. And that is why old entrances feel strange, because older architecture did not aim for comfort first. It aimed for meaning. Every proportion carried a message. Every material announced status. Every threshold marked a line between the everyday world and a space that demanded attention. So the stairs feel wrong because they were meant to feel wrong. The discomfort is intentional. The strain in your legs tells you something before any sign on the wall does. You are entering a place that matters. You are approaching power. You are climbing towards something that does not bend to fit you. This is not cruelty. It is language. A cathedral entrance that feels easy to climb would fail part of its purpose. The difficulty is the point. Every step reminds you that the sacred requires effort, that the holy is not casual. That arrival should cost you something: breath, time, attention. A government hall that welcomes you like a shopping mall would weaken its authority. The imposing entrance says, without words, that serious decisions are made here, that the institution outlives individuals, that the state is larger than the person walking in. We have lost fluency in this language. Modern buildings speak in different tones: accessibility, efficiency, customer experience. Those are not bad values. They are simply different values. And they have made us strangers to the older architectural vocabulary. So no, the stairs were not built for giants. They were built for people who understood that architecture could make you feel small on purpose, that discomfort could be communication, that the effort of climbing was part of the meaning of arrival. We stand at these entrances and feel excluded because we expect buildings to serve our bodies. The old builders expected buildings to shape our minds. The giant doorways are human scale, after all. Just not the kind of scale we measure in centimeters. The architecture shaped minds. The proportions carried meaning. But none of that explains the gaps in the archives. If the stairs were simply ceremonial, why do the records vanish? The answer is less dramatic than a grand conspiracy. And, in a way, more disturbing. Records disappear for ordinary reasons. Fire eats archives. War scatters collections. Floods ruin basements where documents sit in boxes for decades. Those disasters leave no single villain to point at, only empty shelves where knowledge used to be. But ordinary disaster does not fully explain the pattern we kept finding, because the missing material clusters around specific kinds of information. Construction specifications vanish while payment ledgers survive. Original blueprints disappear while later modification notes remain. The oldest layer of evidence suffers the most. The newer layers survive far more often. That is not total destruction. That is selective decay. And selective decay has real causes. When governments change, some records become inconvenient. A new administration does not always want the old one to look competent. A revolutionary regime does not rush to protect the monuments of the system it just overthrew. A modernizing city does not celebrate the messy infrastructure it replaced. And the demolitions we traced did not only remove buildings, they removed context. Not always by burning papers, more often by letting them drift out of care. The files were not copied when pages cracked, not transferred when offices moved, not cataloged when budgets tightened, not treated as important when newer priorities took over. Neglect is quieter than conspiracy, and it is often more effective. In Vienna, records for buildings demolished during the Ringstrasse project were stored in temporary facilities during construction. Those facilities were cleared in 1879. The documents were scheduled for transfer into permanent archives. The transfer never happened. No official order demanded destruction. No dramatic purge occurred. Nobody saved them either. In Chicago, pre-fire construction records were stored in wooden buildings and local offices. The Great Fire took them along with everything else. After Reconstruction, the city moved forward. There was no serious push to rebuild the lost paper trail from secondary sources. The slate was clean, and for a city selling a new future, a clean slate was convenient. In St. Petersburg, architectural archives were reorganized multiple times between 1880 and 1930. Each reorganization misplaced material. Each loss was labeled administrative error. And those errors kept hitting the same target, the oldest records. So the pattern is not a secret meeting in a dark room. It is institutional indifference dressed in bureaucratic language. The records went missing because nobody with power treated them as worth keeping. The giant stairs lost their context because context costs time, money, storage, staff, and attention. The original proportions turned into mysteries because solving mysteries was never anyone's job description. The cover-up was not planned, it simply happened. One office move at a time, one budget cut at a time, one forgotten filing cabinet at a time, until the questions could no longer be answered. The records decayed, the context vanished, and into that empty space stepped a theory that gave the mystery a name: Tartaria. The idea spread through online communities in the early 2010s. A vast empire erased from history. Advanced technology, hidden in plain sight as architecture. Giant inhabitants, proved by oversized doorways. A global civilization deliberately forgotten. The theory is not supported by evidence. No Tartarian skeletons have been verified. No Tartarian documents have surfaced. No Tartarian machines or devices have been recovered from the buried floors beneath modern streets. But the theory still reveals something important. People reach for Tartaria because they feel a gap between the buildings they can touch and the explanations they are given, a gap between what their eyes see, buried windows, raised streets, strange proportions, and what official stories bother to explain. That feeling is not imaginary. The gap is real. We have been documenting it this whole time. Missing records, street raising described too lightly, reconstructions with thin paperwork, demolitions without preservation, and a design language that repeats, across continents without a clear, documented path of how it spread. That gap is not proof of giants, but it is proof of loss, and loss creates hunger. When institutions cannot explain their own history, people invent explanations. When archives decay and experts shrug, theories grow in the silence. Tartaria is not a discovery, it is a symptom. It is a response to real absence, dressed in the language of hidden truth. And the believers are not necessarily stupid. They are paying attention. They noticed the buried windows. They measured oversized steps. They photographed doorways that dwarf modern humans. They asked questions that official sources often dismissed, laughed at, or ignored. Their answers are wrong, but their questions are legitimate because the stairs really do feel unhuman. The streets really did rise. Records really did vanish. And the proportions really do repeat with an uncomfortable tightness. Those observations deserve better than ridicule. They deserve careful work, measurement, comparison, and testing each explanation against what we can actually see. Following the paper trail until it breaks, admitting what we cannot prove, and refusing to pretend that missing context is the same thing as nothing happened. Tartaria is what happens when curiosity collides with institutional failure, when the gap between evidence and explanation grows wide enough for myth to move in. So the solution is not to mock the theory. The solution is to close the gap, to preserve what remains, to document what survives, to answer questions honestly, even when honesty means admitting that some answers may be lost forever. The mystery is not giants. The mystery is how much we have allowed ourselves to forget. We began with a staircase, a first step that hit mid-shin, a doorway that dwarfed everyone who passed through it, a feeling that we arrived too late. Now we return. The same staircase, the same stone, the same proportions that started this investigation. Only now the meaning has shifted. We know the stairs were rebuilt. We know the street rose around the building in layers we can partly trace. We know the proportions served ceremony, status, and crowd movement, not giant bodies. We know the records decayed through neglect more than conspiracy. We know demolitions erased context faster than any secret plan ever could. We know the design language spread through channels we can no longer fully rebuild in our minds. We know the wrong feeling was not an accident. The architects wanted visitors to feel small. Discomfort was part of the message, carved into stone, reinforced by height, repeated in every step. And yet, standing at the base of those stairs, the knowledge does not erase the feeling. The first step still sits too high. The doorway still looms, and the windows nearby still peer up from beneath the sidewalk, like eyes that remember sunlight. The explanations are true, and the mystery still remains. Not mystery in the sense of nothing being answered, We have answered what can be answered, but mystery in the sense of depth, layers beneath layers, of a past that was not simple, not primitive, and not easy to summarize in one clean sentence. The builders who raised these stairs lived in cities we would barely recognize, cities of mud and ceremony, cities that flooded, burned, and rose again, cities that projected power through stone and expected citizens to understand the language. We have lost that language. We walk through their doorways and feel confusion. We measure their stairs and find anomalies. We search their archives and find gaps. But the buildings remain. The proportions persist. The design language still waits, quietly, for anyone willing to learn how to read it. The stairs were not built for giants. They were built for cities that wanted to look eternal, for institutions that wanted to outlast their founders, for a world that believed architecture could shape the soul. That world is buried now, under raised streets and modern pavement, under reconstructions and demolitions, under layers of forgetting that stack up faster than any flood. But the stairs still climb. And if you stand at their base long enough, you can almost hear what they were trying to say. Not a doorway for giants, a doorway for people who believed some threshold should cost effort to cross.